the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and we work here in Ottawa from unceded Algonquin territory in recognition of which OFIP gives a donation every year to the Tegwan House for Indigenous boys and girls here in Ottawa. In a short moment, I'm going to move to share screen. I'm going to talk tonight about Hamas and Israel and the relationship over time. It's a OFIP retrospective. I'm going to start off by sharing screen. And maybe I can ask Grafton to confirm that you're seeing the screen properly.
Yes, I am seeing it.
Okay. Okay, so that's great. So the way we're going to proceed is I have a presentation that lasts about 35 minutes or so. It's cribbed from a course that I gave last winter on Hamas and Israel. It is a retrospective over the last 25 or 30 years, but we're holding it basically on the 2-year anniversary of the October 7th event. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. I'm going to bring it up to almost the current time, but not quite. If you want to ask questions, we can. I have some thoughts about what's going on right now. I think it's a bit of a confused picture. So that's the most current events are not in the presentation we're going to have. Let me just start off by saying that I'm not a member of Hamas. You all know that Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organization in Canada, United States, and Israel. Not so in a number of global South countries, but it is here. I'm not a member of Hamas. That perhaps goes without saying, but I'm also not. I don't give money to Hamas. I don't get money from Hamas. I am. What's going on? I've lost my picture here. Can you still see my screen sharing? I see myself here now. Just a minute.
Yes. Yes, no, I can see agenda.
Okay, so hang on. This is my incompetence. There we go. Okay. Can you see it? I can see it now, the agenda, right?
Yeah.
So I will talk a bit about the background to the current situation. I will give a brief history of Palestinian resistance and then insert Hamas into that history. I will talk a bit about what happened October 7th, Israeli and Palestinian opinion about Hamas, a little bit about the current situation. So that is my share. Okay, that's the way I hope it to be. All right. So
I see it full screen again. Yes.
Quickly jump back to October 7th when everybody was astounded. I remember very much that day. I had been in Gaza a couple of years before. I talked to a lot of those kids who probably were amongst those who broke out, although I don't know them for sure. I must say, when I first heard the news that they had broken out of Gaza, I was thrilled. I was very, very sympathetic. And so my heart soared. So this is terrific. And then, of course, the news started to come in about the terrible allegations of terrible massacres and so on. My heart sank at that. And then I started to think, okay, what's that going to mean? That's going to mean terrible reprisals from Israel. So in the space of 24 hours, my heart went up and down. And I was very upset and unhappy about the way things were unfolding. The Secretary General Antonio Guterres, speaking at the UN Security Council, reminded people the next day that the attack by Hamas on October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. And he talked a little bit about the history. And I'm going to very quickly go over the history here because it's very relevant, but I think it's something that probably most people on this call already are well aware of. But if you excuse me for just doing 3 or 4 minutes on the history. European Jews have been immigrating to Palestine since the late 1800s, mostly from Russia and the Eastern Europe. But the colonization began to rapidly increase after Britain took over the Palestine Mandate in 1921. And then after the Holocaust, there was a bigger flood of European Jews coming, and the UN proposed to make a state for Jews in part of Palestine. But of course, that was a huge problem because there were already 1 million Palestinians living there. And how do you create a Jewish state when the Jewish colonists are in a minority. Well, the main way to do it is to expel the people who were there. And that led to the Nakba. So over the next 12 months, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from Palestine. And in May 1948, Israel declared its independence. Now, the Nakba was an operation in which the Zionists were very well prepared and organized, and the Palestinians were totally unprepared and unorganized. And there were many massacres. And you see on the map on the left, there was chaotic fleeing to all the neighboring regions. They fled up north to Lebanon, over to Syria, to Jordan, down into Egypt, and into what became the West Bank over here. And a lot fled into Gaza. And in fact, Gaza became the largest concentration of Palestinian refugees. And the desire of the Palestinians in Gaza to return to their homes has been a huge problem for Israel ever since. Israel doesn't want them to return, of course, because that would put in jeopardy the Jewish majority of Israel. Broadly speaking, there have been three stages of Israeli colonization of Palestine since 1947. The Nakba was the first stage, 1947-48. About 750,000 were expelled. In 1967, the West Bank, another 200,000 were expelled as Israel took over the West Bank. And then the third wave is now where Israel is expelling people from Gaza, or trying to expel them from Gaza, and as we all know, taking over the West Bank as well. So those are the three major stages of Israeli colonization. Throughout the peace, it's been an unequal battle. Israel, of course, has an army and an air force with bulldozers, tanks, fighter planes, and so on. Palestinians really only have some light arms, some homemade weapons, and they're reduced to pleading at the UN, demonstrations, calls to boycott, and so on. But overall, Israel has been too strong. And of course, it has the support of the USA and of most Western countries, including Canada. So the Palestinians are always on a rear foot, resisting how they can, including resisting through terrorism and suicide bombing. Palestinians have been resisting the takeover of their country since 1919. In fact, there was a Palestinian Arab Congress that was formed as soon as they learned of the Balfour Declaration, in which the British said they had a plan to make a homeland for Jews in Palestine. You may have heard of the other organizations like Fatah, which was a Palestinian nationalist party. It was the party that Yasser Arafat was head of. That was formed in 1950. 1967, after the second batch of ethnic cleansing after the June 4th, 1967 war, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was formed, and its head was a man named Dr. George Habash. In 1981, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was formed. It's a Palestinian Islamist paramilitary organization. 1987, Hamas was formed, the Islamic Resistance Movement. And much more recently, in 2002, there was the creation of what was called the Palestinian National Initiative, a kind of a center-left party headed by Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, which is more of a parliamentary party than a resistance organization. Now, I want to situate Hamas in the context of other national liberation movements. I'm giving 5 examples that we all know about. One is, of course, the FLN, which was the Algerian National Liberation Front, Front de Libération Nationale, which carried out a guerrilla war and then an armed war against France and forced the French out of Algeria. There was the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the KLFA, which the British called the Mau Mau. There was the African National Congress, which everybody here knows something about as well, which led to the end of the apartheid system in South Africa. There was the Force Française de l'Intérieur, which was a French national liberation movement in France under German occupation. And there was an example of the Irish Republican Army, which was also an Irish liberation movement. Now, national liberation movements have 4 common elements in them. First of all, it's anti-colonialism, a resistance to colonial or imperial powers. They call for self-determination, a demand for independence, and the right to govern themselves. They're usually formed on nationalism based on shared identity, culture, including often religion and history. And they often are motivated by the social and economic inequalities inherent under colonial regimes. National liberation movements use a common suite of tactics. They use nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, boycotts, and peaceful protests. They use diplomacy, international lobbying, and so on. And they use armed struggle. And the UN has agreed that people in the struggle for liberation have the right to use armed struggle. Now, the suite of methods that are used by different liberation movements depends on their situation. So, for example, in India, there wasn't much need for armed struggle, but the mass of Indians made civil disobedience and boycotts a very powerful tool and led to British leaving. Other liberation movements, for example, in Algeria, it was much more of an armed struggle from the get-go. But different organizations use a different suite based on the situation they're facing. Now we come to Hamas. Now the word Hamas comes from, and for anybody who speaks Arabic, I apologize in advance, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which translate to be the Islamic resistance movement. In fact, when you hear Palestinians talking about Hamas, when they're talking about it in English, they talk about the movement. So HMS is the Islamic resistance movement. We refer to it as Hamas, kind of like we would refer to the NDP as a party or the PQ as a party. Hamas is a political party. It was formed in 1987 during the first Intifada, and it was formed in the face of the corruption and weakness of Fatah, which was Yasser Arafat's party. And Arafat's inability to make progress through peace talks, UN resolutions, and so on, led Fatah to make a declaration that that's not going to work. And it was also in respect of the failure of secular Arab movements, like Nasser's movement, saying that secular movements are not going to do it. And so they set out as their objective to recover all of Palestine, which had been taken over starting in 1947-48, taking over all of modern-day Israel, and to establish a new state on a religious basis based on Islamic principles. Its founder, Sheikh, I can't remember his name, Sheikh Yassin, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. The first Hamas covenant, the constitution, if you will, was written in 1988. It was deeply religious, as I said earlier. It called for armed struggle, and it included statements as well that were clearly anti-Semitic. For example, in Article 8 on religion, it said that jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. On armed struggle and on the international conferences and so on, it said there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through struggle. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. And by that time, they had, for example, they knew that UN Resolution 194, passed in 1949, had said that the Palestinians have the right to return. That resolution was passed in the UN every year since then, but never happened. So they came to the conclusion that initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time. In Article 22 on the worldwide power of Jews, the covenant said that the Jews were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution. With their money, they formed secret societies such as Freemasons, Rotary clubs, the Lions, and others in different parts of the world for the purposes of achieving Zionist interests. I think in another part, they actually referred to the protocols of the elders of Zion, another anti-Semitic element. These are clearly anti-Semitic and not acceptable to me, and not acceptable, I think, to anybody who's paying attention today. I'll come back on that later on because they did rectify it. Hamas started as a Muslim social movement, not as a political movement. It was doing goods for children and for old people and so on. It was initially supported by Israel as a counterbalance to the secular PLO, to Arafat's PLO, because the Israelis saw PLO as the main liberation movement at that time. But Hamas became progressively more militant as the PLO failed to stop the colonization of the West Bank. And it began to attack Israeli military targets and settlers in the West Bank. And then later on, it undertook a whole series, for about 10 years, it took on a series of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians. And that, of course, has traumatized Israeli society ever since. But in 2005, a new opening occurred for the Palestinians. First of all, under pressure from the USA, Israel pulled its settlers out of Gaza. Secondly, it agreed to holding elections in the occupied territories in 2006. Israel was not very keen on this, but George Bush insisted, and the Israelis agreed to it. And they agreed to allowing international observers, over 200, to come to observe the elections. And Hamas decided to take a gamble. It decided that it would participate in these elections. And its leader at that time was Ismail Haniyeh, who led Hamas in the 2006 elections. Unfortunately, he was assassinated by Israel sometime later. However, surprising, the Hamas gamble paid off. Abbas and the PA were rejected by most voters, and Hamas won in most areas. Sometimes people say Hamas won in Gaza and the PA won in the West Bank. That's not exactly what happened. If you see the map on the right-hand side, you can see the West Bank is the big kidney-shaped area on the right-hand side, and then Gaza is the little strip down the left. The green are the governments that were won by Hamas, and the yellow are the ones that were won by Fatah. So you can see that the Hamas won a large plurality. This was shocking to Israel, who actually had feared this would happen, and shocking to the Bush administration, but they refused to accept the results. Hamas agreed to share power with Fatah, but that was refused, and Israel and the United States encouraged Abbas to ignore the results of the election and to continue to rule by decree, which he could do because the presidential election had been the previous year. So Abbas had been elected in 2005, and he just ignored the Palestinian elections of 2006. Abbas was able to continue to rule by decree in the West Bank, but they were not able to do so in Gaza. And Hamas defeated an attempted coup by the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. And since then, that's led to the situation where Hamas rules in the West Bank and Hamas takes over the government in Gaza. So Israel was furious at Hamas's victory and imposed a complete siege, land, sea, and air, over the 2.2 million people on Hamas-ruled Gaza. No one and no thing was allowed in or out. So you can see here on the right, you can see the map. This is Gaza. It's 360 square kilometers, about 15% of the size of Ottawa. It's a large concentration camp, and it was surrounded by these walls. In some cases, these walls you can actually see through, but they're barbed wire at the top. Over here, you can see concrete walls. Inside this area, you have about 2 million people, very young, very poor, and very well educated. Thanks to the UN, there were 8 universities in Gaza, and they had a very high literacy rate. But these young people had no future, which led to obviously increased their frustration. And the main demands of the people in Gaza was the end of the blockade and the right to return to what is now Israel and recover their country, which of course is something that Israel did not want to allow at all. So Hamas then became the government in Gaza. It wasn't really what they had wanted in the first place, but they ended up being responsible for schools, hospitals, sewers, and electricity. They also became responsible for diplomacy. So Hamas leaders would go around the world. For example, here's the people meeting with Erdogan in Turkey. Is Haniyeh talking to, I don't know who that person is. Maybe someone could help me. But they were also responsible for defense, and they continued military attacks on the Israeli border guards, which were keeping them fenced in. And they fired rockets into Israel over time. But the rockets themselves were mostly theater. They had little effect. In fact, according to Wikipedia, from 2004 to 2014, Hamas rockets had killed 27 Israeli civilians, which means about 3 people a year. Nonetheless, Israel made a big deal about the threat from Hamas, but in actual fact, it was not anything near an existential threat. Because Hamas continued to resist the siege, Israel increased its repression. And after 2007, there were 4 major Israeli assaults, mostly air and artillery assaults, cast lead, pillar of cloud, protective edge. Each one left thousands of Palestinians dead, 6,000 in all. And There was some shooting at the borders and some incursions by Israeli soldiers, and 300 Israeli soldiers were killed as well through this. But they were more like Israel called them mowing the lawn, trying to keep Hamas and the Palestinians under control. In 2017, Hamas rewrote its charter. Hamas Mashal released a new charter which addressed some of those problematic earlier issues. It was a charter that Patrick Martin, the former Globe and Mail correspondent in Gaza at the time, said was a significant step. And some of its main elements include eliminating the crude anti-Semitic language of the earlier document. It specified that our fight is against the Zionist takeover of Palestine, not against Jews. It downplayed the Islamic and religious nature of it and played up its national nature, but it did retain its right to use armed force. And I have the reference there if someone wants to go and check it, the complete document. In the next year, Hamas adopted a new tactic, a civil, massive, non-violent civil disobedience movement, kind of like what the Indians did, or sometimes the South Africans did. It was a peaceful march to the fence and demanding the right to return. So here's a cartoon of the people marching to the fence, demanding the return. And their calculation was that Israel would not be able to stop a peaceful march to the fence, and that the Western powers would not allow Israel to do that. It was a bad bargain. In fact, they faced Israeli sniper fire, and many were killed. 205 unarmed Palestinians were killed there. I was there at the time. This picture you see on the bottom right is taken from the Israeli side, so you can see there's a berm there. You can see the Israeli trucks at the bottom. They're firing tear gas, and I was tear gassed. I was back here far away, not near the edge. And these people, the Israelis in this black tent here, were the snipers, and they would snipe people. And I saw people being hit by sniper fire in front of me as I was getting tear gassed. In any event, 21,000 Palestinians were injured. 11,000 had to go to the hospital. And Israel faced really no consequence from the West. Canada only said something when a Canadian doctor who was there, Tarek Lubani, was shot in the leg. Mr. Trudeau made some very stern statements about how this should be investigated, and then nothing ever happened. So the bet that Hamas had made that a peaceful demonstration of the Indian nature would force Israel, force the world to deal with the issue of the return was stymied. At the same time, things continued to get worse for Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and Jerusalem. There's a rapid increase in new settlement construction in the West Bank. Hundreds of checkpoints being established with block circulation, making it very difficult for Palestinians to move around the West Bank. Settlers were increasingly attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque. When Palestinians went to pray, they would be attacked by Israeli police. The settlers were killing increasing number of Palestinians. Sometimes you hear the Israelis say that that Hamas broke a truce. And actually, in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. By October 7th, in 2003, Israeli forces had already killed over 200 people in the West Bank. And at the same time, as you know, Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, had been promoting the Abraham Accords, which seemed like threatening to sideline the Palestinians completely and make their struggle completely invisible. So this left an issue what to do. Hamas faced a strategic dilemma. It had discovered that UN resolutions were ignored, that the rockets it fired into Israel really weren't powerful enough to do any serious damage, that when they had a democratic election that they were elected, it was not respected by Israel and the foreign powers, particularly the US, that the peace negotiations went on and on and on, but never really accomplished anything, that even other lawfare like BDS was being ignored or even criminalized in some places in the United States, and that when they did peaceful disobedience, it was repressed in bloodshed, and the West would look the other way. So Hamas made a calculation that dangerous, dramatic action was necessary, and that led to October 7th, the operation that Hamas calls Al-Aqsa flood. Al-Aqsa being, of course, the mosque, the important mosque in Jerusalem. And on October 7th, armed Palestinian groups from the Gaza Strait infiltrated, escaped into this area around here where there are Israeli settlements, most of them on towns that had been Palestinian towns before 1967. Now, there are two different narratives about what went on the 7th. One narrative, the Israeli narrative, is that anti-Semitic Palestinian terrorists surprised Israeli defenses, broke out of Gaza to take revenge on Israel by killing as many Jews as possible and causing general mayhem. It was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. There's another narrative, the Hamas narrative, which that a Palestinian national resistance movement broke out of the Gaza prison with the objective of showing Israel and the world that the Palestinian issue was not dead, was aimed at killing their IDF prison guards and taking hostages to be used to trade against the thousands of Palestinians languishing in Israeli prisons. There are, however, some agreed facts. Agreed facts are that about 1,500, more or less, Palestinian militants break out of Gaza. Now, it may be that 1,000 of them or so were Hamas militants, and another 500 to 1,000 were others who took advantage to get out. They were using, the Hamas militants were using uniforms. They were using motorcycles, pickup trucks, and motorized gliders. Mostly they had light weapons, rifles and machine guns. And they attacked Israeli military positions, killing over 350 Israeli military, their guards, in about 24 hours of fighting. And in addition, another 650 Israeli civilians and an unknown number of Palestinians were killed over the next 24 hours. Then the Palestinian militants took 250 Israeli hostages back to Gaza. That's uncontested. I think everyone agrees to that. Here's the breakout map again. You can see there's the checkpoint areas. When I went into Gaza, I would go through checkpoint areas. Here's Egypt down here. And you see these military bases around. But the Palestinian bulldozer here ripped up the border fence. And then when he did that, it was military action, but a lot of commotion. The Israeli defense, which had been seen to be impenetrable, was broken through much more quickly than expected. And hundreds of traumatized and angry teenagers break out of their Israeli prison for the first time in their lives. And I think this is an important, we talk a lot about soldiers having PTSD, committing suicide, being violent when they get home. A lot of these young Palestinian boys have a kind of equivalent of PTSD from seeing their brothers and sisters and mothers killed, their houses ruined and so on. A lot of them have a burnt up rage. And these people are not the Palestinian Hamas militants. These are young people who are for the first time able to break through and sometimes even go to the village where their parents had been driven out from, or the grandparents had been driven out from 50 some years before. Independent observations have been made. The UN agreed that both sides committed war crimes. Haaretz noted that many Israeli civilians were killed by Israeli fire to prevent them from being taken hostage. This is the famous Hannibal Directive. Hannibal Directive is an Israeli military directive that says that if hostages are likely to be taken, the military is to use whatever force necessary to prevent that from happening, even if it means killing some Israelis in the process. So the Israeli narrative is that Hamas was motivated by anti-Semitism. It deliberately set out to murder innocent civilians. It was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It alleged that there was systematic rape, torture, atrocities, and wanton murder of civilians. The Palestinians are animals, and Hamas broke a de facto truce. And you can see the Israeli narrative was picked up by newspapers around the world. And here's the throats of the babies being cut, or the widespread sexual violence. And this narrative was taken to the US Congress by Benjamin Netanyahu. You can look at the clip there. I'm not going to play it now. basically said at 6 o'clock in the morning, while children were still dreaming in their beds, hell descended on them from above. And even the US President Biden said that he had actually seen Hamas militants beheading babies. That had to be walked back carefully later on because it wasn't true. Now, the Hamas narrative is quite different, and there's some paying attention to. First of all, it's difficult to find the Hamas. If you haven't heard the Hamas narrative, it's because it's not easy to find. Hamas did have a website. The website of Hamas has been shut down by whoever it is in charge of controlling websites. Hamas is not allowed to be on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, X, and so on. So if you want to hear or read the Hamas narrative, you have to really be anxious to do so. But basically, they did publish a document in January 2024 called Our Narrative. It's available at the site that I have listed down here at the bottom if you're really interested in reading the whole thing. I've summarized it more or less. First of all, they say that as an imprisoned and occupied people, we have the right to use armed force against our oppressors. That right is enshrined in that UN resolution I referred to earlier. We targeted Israeli military sites to capture soldiers and force a release of the thousands of Palestinians held for years in Israeli jails. We gave instructions, says Hamas, we gave instructions to our soldiers that not to harm civilians. But the rapid collapse of the Israeli security surprised us and caused chaos. And some things happened which should not have happened. They deny completely the claims of the beheaded babies and the systematic rape of Israeli women. And they say that many of the Israeli civilians were killed by Israeli military following the Hannibal Directive, or by bombing and shooting where Palestinian fighters and Israelis were together. You can go, I'm not going to play it now, you can go on this site where Jewish Israeli historian Avi Schleim talks about the Israeli narrative. And he explains that we've heard only the Hamas narrative, only the Israeli narrative. And he points out that Hamas asked for an immediate international investigation of the events, and Israel refused to let it happen. Now, I have one other person I'm going to cite on the Hamas narrative. You're going to have to indulge me here. I'm going to try to play this little YouTube clip for you, 4 minutes, from John Mearsheimer, who is a professor of international politics at the University of Chicago. And Dr. Mearsheimer claims that Hamas did not kill 1,200 Israelis on October 7th, notwithstanding what we're told over and over again. 1,200 certainly died, but he claims that Israel's own fire killed many of its people, but that our media won't say it.
That includes.
There's one simple warm water trick that anyone can use to improve eyesight almost overnight. Thousands of people are already doing this every night as they sleep.
The Hannibal doctrine. The fact is that the Israelis got caught completely by surprise.
Yes.
They did not have a very good backup plan. So what they did was they rushed in massive firepower, and they used that firepower to attack Hamas and the other Palestinian forces that had moved into Israel proper. And they killed a significant number of people, not with the Hannibal doctrine, but just with all that firepower that was brought to bear against Hamas and other Palestinians who were intermingled with all sorts of Israelis. Then there's the whole issue of the Hannibal doctrine, because as we know, the Palestinians were bent on taking many of their captured Israelis back to Gaza. And the Hannibal doctrine calls for killing those people before they get there. So some Israelis were killed as a result of the Hannibal doctrine. And then you want to remember, on top of all that, it's consistent with international law for Hamas to try to break out of the concentration camp and to engage Israeli military forces in combat, which means they're going to kill some of them. So the fact that they killed Israeli soldiers is not a case of murder. Now, there were clearly Israeli civilians who were murdered. I'd be willing to bet in the final analysis, however, that Hamas did not murder many of those Israeli civilians. But be that as it may, whoever murdered those civilians, and in my mind created a war crime, committed a war crime. But I think that most of the Israelis who were killed were either soldiers, who I think are legitimate targets, or they were civilians who were killed by the Israeli forces. I think you cannot underestimate how many Israelis were killed when all that firepower was brought to bear. And if you look at a lot of the pictures and you listen to what happened, it's quite clear that those Apache helicopters really wreaked havoc on everything that was down on the ground. And of course, that included Israeli civilians. So I think we have a pretty good sense of what happened. Now, is that reported in the Western media? As Susan was saying before, of course it isn't. The stories that you hear.
Oh, just lost the audio.
Okay, I just shut the audio off. I just want to come back to here. Share. Didn't mean stop sharing. Stop share. Okay, I gotta come back to share. Sorry, folks. Just there we go. Share and do. There we go. So you can see there were the two narratives are contradictory. You can decide which one you think is more plausible. I think there is a lot of reasons to believe that things did not unfold exactly as Israel has claimed, and as mostly our newspapers have picked up and repeated. What we do know, however, is that after October 7, of course, Israel retaliated. It immediately cut off water and food, and its declared objective was to eliminate Hamas. And ground operations began on the 27th of October, and thousands of Palestinians were killed in that process or taken prisoner. You see in the picture at the top right, these are Palestinians in Gaza who were taken prisoner. Some of them were ones that were taken basically by Israel as hostages, and they're the part of the thousands that have been sent back as part of the prisoner exchange. The Palestinians were subjected to bombing and then famine, and according to the recent statistics from the UN, about 65,000 Palestinians have been killed, 165,000 injured. Those numbers are actually contested by some organizations. The Gaza Health Ministry sticks to 65,000, but the British medical journal, The Lancet, thinks that the death toll is much, much higher. In fact, they guess that it may well be 3 to 15 times higher once all the ruins are dug out. The international reaction after October 7th is, of course, there was worldwide sympathy for Israel. It was shocking, and people were horrified by the stories of rape, the babies beheaded, and so on, the kidnapping. And the U.S. support for Israel soared after October 7th. But gradually, the international climate started to change at the scale of the Israeli destruction. The UN Security Council, the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, all severely critical of Israel. The International Court of Justice said it's a presumed case of plausible case of genocide. International Criminal Court, of course, accused Benjamin Netanyahu of crimes against humanity. There were thousands of demonstrations around the world. Israel's traditional allies in the West generally urged ceasefire, but didn't really apply much pressure, and that includes Canada. In fact, it took Canada a long time to even ask for a ceasefire. And the U.S. support, of course, remained at the heart of it and continues to send arms and defend Israel at the UN. Now, the reaction inside Israel to this and to Hamas is interesting. First of all, look at the Israeli reaction. We've all heard about massive demonstrations in Israel against Netanyahu, and that's true. Israelis really wanted Netanyahu to rescue the hostages, and they were angry that he hadn't done so. But polls have shown that while they don't like Netanyahu, there is overwhelming support for attacks on the Palestinians. Now, we have the results here of a study in March 2025, Penn State University, which showed, it was quite shocking, which showed the first one I look at the top is the rate of Jewish Israelis who support expulsion of Gaza residents. So the blue is the secular Israelis, traditional Israelis, Orthodox, and then the Haredi, the most religious. But you see that there is consistently 75 or 80% of Jewish Israelis who think that the Palestinians in Gaza should be expelled. Similarly, not quite as high numbers, but still high numbers of Jewish Israelis also think that the Palestinians living in Israel should be expelled. They call them Israeli Arabs, but those are Palestinians living in Israel. And perhaps the most shocking of all is the number of Jewish Israelis who believe that all the residents of a conquered enemy city, like Khan Yunis or Gaza, whatever, should be killed. This is quite alarming and is not consistent with the widespread notion that it's because of Bibi that we have this issue going on. In fact, Netanyahu is responding to widespread anti-Palestinian sentiment inside Israel. I was in Israel in April, and this survey conforms exactly to what I saw, this survey taken in July. You see here, how much are you personally troubled by the report of famine and suffering amongst the Palestinian people? Well, 6.7% of Israelis say that they're very troubled. 13% say a little bit troubled, and the rest say they're not so troubled or not troubled at all. So when I was there in Jerusalem, people were going to their cafes and eating outdoors and so on. You'd never know that 60 miles away, a famine and genocide was going on. It was Jerusalem is just as far from Gaza City as Ottawa is, psychologically, I mean. Now, if you flip it over and look at the Palestinian side, it's also quite interesting. This is a survey done by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in May of this year. It's generally regarded as the most reliable of the Palestinian survey organizations. On this slide, the blue represents support for Fatah or the PLO or the PA. The gold represents support for Hamas. The gray represents support for third parties, including Mustafa Barghouti. And the yellow represents don't know or no opinion, no answer. Now, what's surprising for most Canadians, I think, is the extent of the support for Hamas. September 23rd, just before the October 7th event, Hamas and the PA were roughly equal, according to this survey. But afterwards, the support for Hamas increased. And in fact, even today, Hamas's support is 50% more than it is for the PA. So it's not true that you get a peculiar discourse from the Israelis who say two things that are contradictory. Either that everybody in Gaza is Hamas and therefore we should kill everybody, or the opposite, nobody is in Hamas. Hamas is just a small group of dictators that are running the real people. This tells a different story. This says that Hamas is seen by Palestinians as a legitimate political party that's deserving of their support. So what's the current situation? Well, first of all, Hamas is down, but not out. Their leadership has definitely been badly damaged, but they're still able to fight and negotiate. So they can send a negotiating team to Doha or send a negotiating team to meet with Trump and Qatar and so on. Hamas's immediate objectives are a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of all IDF forces from Gaza, a prisoner exchange, they get their prisoners back and returning, giving up the hostages, and resumption of humanitarian aid. On the other side, Israel has been unable to eliminate Hamas or to drive out the Palestinians, so it is now in tactical retreat. Its immediate objectives are the release of all Israeli hostages, and that's now been accomplished, as you know, as of last Monday. The elimination of Hamas's military and governance capability, and that's a long ways from being clear, and the removal of, quote unquote, the terrorist threat from the Gaza Strip, which means, again, Hamas's military capability. So here's my conclusion that I do a retrospect on Israel, Hamas over time. Hamas, otherwise the Islamic resistance movement, has many of the characteristics of a traditional national liberation movement. For example, the FLN, the IRA, and the ANC. And it shares with a couple of things with national liberation movements. One is that it's very weak militarily compared to the colonial powers that are facing it. They're also all called terrorists. Hamas is called a terrorist organization, but so was the IRA, so was Nelson Mandela, and so on and so forth. The objective of Hamas is to liberate Palestine from the Israeli colonization of its country. It uses the same mix of tactics used by other national liberation movements in other countries: diplomacy, nonviolent mass demonstrations, and armed struggle. We in Canada tend to think of it primarily for the armed struggle. That's because the West and Israel has shut down its diplomacy. It's not had any success at the UN. And as I showed you, they've shut down mass demonstrations. So we think of Hamas as being principally based on armed struggle. But despite the failure of October 7 and 2 years of genocidal attack by Israel, it retains significant popularity amongst Palestinians. So if Palestinians do have the right to self-determination, which Canada says, then it seems that Hamas has to be allowed some kind of role in governing Palestine. So there we are. That's my presentation, and I'll stop sharing. And I already saw there's a number of questions and the Q&A. Grafton, you're looking at that in the chat. The one I'm happy to have not just questions, but happy to have people disagree with me. That's fine, par for the course. I'd like to, if you're going to ask questions, please make them germane to the issue of Hamas and Israel rather than other questions like what I think Donald Trump will do or whatever. Just try to focus it on the discussion for tonight. So, Grafton, I'll leave you to choose amongst the questions. And
yes, I think we could get started with most world leaders, particularly in the Trump plan, and Trump has been insistent on this even over the last 24 hours, is that Hamas give up its weapons, that it disarm. What do you suppose would happen if Hamas were to give up its weapons?
Well, I guess the way you answer that depends on what you think Israel's objectives are. If you think that Israel's objective is to live peacefully and quietly alongside Palestinians, then you can expect Hamas would give up its weapons. Israel would have no more reason to attack the Palestinians, and life would just be wonderful. If you assume, as Hamas does, and as many Palestinians do, and I'm inclined to agree with them, that Israel's objective from the beginning, from 1947, was to take over all of Palestine and eliminate as many Palestinians as possible, either by driving them out or killing them if necessary. It drove them out mostly in 1947-48. It killed some, but not mostly. In 1967, it drove out more, killed some, but not mostly. However, in Gaza, it's driving them out hasn't worked. Egypt and has not accepted them. Jordan has not accepted them. So Israel seems to be prepared to kill them. So in that circumstance, if you think that Israel's real objective is to get rid of the Palestinians, then if Hamas gives up its weapons, what do you think would happen? You would imagine that Israel still continued to try to drive out the Palestinians. So that's what I think would happen if Hamas gave up its weapons. And I think that's what most Palestinians think as well.
Thank you. There have been reports that there were indications that something was going to happen on October 7th, but the Israeli authorities ignored it, possibly deliberately. Do you know anything about this?
I've seen lots of reports. So what you're referring to here, what the questioner is referring to is that there are some claims that maybe this whole thing was a false flag operation. Maybe it's like the Gulf of Tonkin or perhaps Pearl Harbor. So maybe Israel sucked in Hamas, encouraged Hamas to make the attack, and then used that as a way to pursue its objective, its long-standing objective of trying to get the Palestinians out of Gaza. I've heard people argue that. I think there is some evidence for it. On the other hand, the evidence relates to the fact that Israel had forewarning of it. But as we know from these kinds of situations, it may well have had 6 forewarnings at other times as well. So you never know when it's the real time. I'm not convinced that it's a false flag operation, and I would not argue that. What I would say is I think probably Israel had its objective in mind, and when this happened, the way it happened, provided them an opportunity to tell the world, show the world how awful Hamas was, and to project power into Gaza in a way they had not been. Remember those previous attacks on Gaza, 2014, 16, and so on, had gone on for a month or two, and finally the world opinion had said, you got to stop. So Israel stopped. This time, they were able to make a successful case that Hamas had been horrific and had made this terrible attack on unsuspecting Jews, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. So Israel was able to pursue its objective very aggressively. So I'm more inclined to think it was an opportunistic use of the situation. It may well have been a security fault at the fence. But it definitely was a security fault at the fence because that fence was supposed to be impenetrable.
Thank you. One listener asked if there will be a recording of this webinar made available later, and the answer is yes. We will, over the next couple of days, post this to all people who registered. I also noticed there were a couple of participants who had their hand up. If they would like to pose a question, please write it in the Q&A. Here's a short question, but perhaps a large question. Did October 7th really fail?
That's an interesting question. And I think I'm torn on that, and I'll say two different thoughts about it. But at one level, it has been catastrophic for the people in Gaza. And I don't know whether the Hamas leaders certainly had to expect that Israel was going to retaliate as it had done before. I don't know whether they anticipated that the retaliation would be as ferocious as it was, or that the West would tolerate it. It may be that they believed Western platitudes that we believe in human rights and equality and so on. So maybe that was a failure. On the other hand, we don't know if the October 7th has really failed yet. We will see how public opinion evolves. National liberation movements have moments that do fail. The Tet Offensive was a military failure, and yet in the end, the Vietnamese were able to drive the Americans out of Vietnam, not because they were militarily more powerful than the Americans, but because public opinion and world opinion turned massively against the United States. Similarly, the FLN fighting in Algeria they took terrible losses. Over 1 million people were killed by French forces. But in the end, world opinion turned against France. And in fact, there were significant internal discord in France. So I don't think we know yet whether October 7th has really failed.
I guess kind of a related question. What is your analysis of the current situation after the peace plan compared to what it was on October 6th, 2023? That is the day before the breakout.
That's a very good question, and to which I have only, I'll give a half an answer. I'm still processing what is happening now, the peace plan, the fact that Israel does not seem to be observing it, that there's still people being shot, that Israel's claiming that some of the dead bodies have not been returned, and so on. But I will say, in general, at the very best, the peace plan returns the situation to October 6th, 2023, which was already intolerable, with the addition of the fact that Gaza has been destroyed. Now there is an urgent situation in Gaza. Where and how are people going to live? So the situation for the Palestinians in Gaza is catastrophically worse than it was now. How that will play out on the international plan, now that the hostages have been returned and Israel can no longer point to that as the reason for carrying on the fight, How will international public opinion evolve on this remains to be seen. Grafton?
Sorry, I turned my my audio was off.
Okay.
Can Israel ever eliminate Hamas?
Let me give an analogy for why I don't think so. I'm of an age to remember the fear in Canada at the time of the Quebec independence referendum. We were really scared that René Lévesque and the Parti Québécois were going to take Canada out of Confederation. But I don't think anybody thought that the issue could be resolved by assassinating René Lévesque and his cabinet. And I think getting rid of Hamas leadership is not going to resolve the issue. I think the evidence has been shown that despite the huge amount of repression and genocide, Hamas numbers are growing. That's a report from the Times of Israel, not from Hamas propaganda wing. As long as the issue is unresolved, whether it's Hamas or another name for a resistance movement, and as long as Israel is colonizing Palestine, the Palestinians are going to resist. There are only two ways, I think, to answer this. Only two ways could there be peace in the Israel-Palestine issue. One way is if the Israelis succeeded in killing every single Palestinian, or so many that they were just marginalized. That sounds horrible. It is horrible, but don't forget, that's basically what Europeans did to indigenous peoples here in Canada. We basically eliminated them, and now they are a marginal force and not able to reverse things. So that's one way Israel could get peace. The other way is if Israel can be forced to give up its ideology based on the fact that Jews are superior, that the notion of Jewish supremacy, that all of Palestine belongs to Jews, and that they are going to suppress anybody or expel anybody who does not go along with that. Now, how could you possibly eliminate that ideology, which is so widespread in Israel? I don't have an answer to that. We have some precedents from history. How did Nazism get eliminated in Germany? It was only eliminated at the end of a world war in which Germany was physically crushed and its Nazi leaders were brought on trial. I don't know if that's going to, I hope that's not going to have to happen in Israel. But until Israeli leaders and society give up this notion that they are superior and that all that territory belongs to them and no one else, we're not going to have peace.
This question refers more to internal affairs within Gaza, and I think would refer mainly prior to October 7th. How would you evaluate Hamas's governance of Gaza in recent years? And did they show any sign of a constructive approach to the situation confronted by Palestinian peoples? Perhaps you can talk a little bit about how they manage sort of day-to-day affairs in Gaza.
I've only been to Gaza twice. I was there in 2016 and 2018, and I was there for a couple of weeks. I had a fixer who introduced me to people. I traveled around, had lots of meetings. I met some people from Hamas. I met some people who were from other political parties. It's so hard to answer that question because they were living under so much pressure. For example, electricity was limited. Everything was controlled. They couldn't get for a while in Gaza. Israel actually had a mathematical formula to make sure that there was just enough calories coming in to keep people alive, but not better. It's very hard to make a judgment of Hamas capability to rule under the terrible conditions they were working under. I met people in Gaza who were quite critical of Hamas, and I met people in Gaza who supported Hamas. one of the things that surprised me is I did attend a meeting where supporters and critics were arguing. I had a translator who was helping me, and I was surprised at how fierce the debate was. And I said to my fixer afterwards, geez, I'm really surprised that you're allowed to make that kind of criticism of Hamas. And he looked at me kind of surprised, and he said, well, it's not Egypt here, which I thought was a funny answer because I actually thought that Gaza was Egypt. He had been in jail in Egypt, so he knew something about what he was talking about.
That's a good segue into another series of questions related to Hamas's relations with other Arab nations, specifically Egypt, but also with the Gulf states and so on. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think I see one of the questions here is why hasn't Hamas ever attacked Egypt? It's true that Egypt enforces the blockade with Israel. Hamas and Israel work together on that. Israel is afraid of. Israel is largely dependent on U.S. Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, and Egypt is the second largest. I guess emotionally, Hamas is focused on returning to the land they come from. Israel is the body, the society that has expelled them and refused to allow them to return. The Hamas people are not trying to get the right to go to Egypt. They're trying to get the right to go back to Israel. On a larger issue, let's turn it over and why Arab countries have not been more supportive of the Palestinians. I'm actually going to organize my next webinar is going to be on this very topic with a former senior person with the CIA who knows a lot of it. Was posted in the region, and we're going to talk about why Arab countries have not been more supportive of Palestinians. Something that we would have expected. In the short answer, the very short answer, however, is that the Arab country leaders are all afraid of Hamas. Don't forget, Hamas is the only democratically elected force in that area. It's surrounded. Sisi came together by a coup. We have royal kings elsewhere. They're all afraid of popular movements, and if Hamas is successful, that's going to represent a threat to their own situation. So the dictators and kings and sheiks around Gaza are scared to death of Hamas, and that's one of the reasons why they're not giving them more support. And they're even more scared because Hamas and Palestinians have massive support on the streets of all those countries.
Do you think that Netanyahu and his cabinet will accept the peace plan, or will they find an excuse to continue the war?
Well, I did partly answer this earlier, and I'll say it again. I believe that the Netanyahu reflects the sentiment of the Israeli society. And that sentiment is they want to get rid of the Palestinians by hook or by crook. They did it first in 1947-48. They did more in 1967, and now they're trying to do more. So I don't think he wants peace. He will not have peace until he's completely expelled the Palestinians. That's my view.
Why doesn't the Canadian government take concrete action like the Prime Minister promised several months ago? Why are we still maintaining diplomatic ties with Israel, or indeed, are there other actions that we can or should be taking, and why aren't we?
Well, I think it's complex. It's not an easy. I think there are a number of elements to that. One, of course, is that what is number one on Mr. Carney's mind right now? It's Trump. It's the Stellantis. It's the auto sector. It's the softwood lumber sector. It's the steel sector, and so on. So if I were giving advice to Mr. Carney, or at least as a liberal advisor to Mr. Carney, I'd say, listen, being very active on the Israel-Palestine file of supporting the Palestinians may make you feel good, but it's going to get us into a lot of trouble with the United States. So keep away from it. That's not the moral position, but I think that's one of the reasons. Another reason, of course, is the efficacy of the Israel lobby, which is very effective in Canada, very well plugged in. A third element, I think, is there is a swath of racism and fear in Canadian society, fear of Islamic fundamentalism and so on. So that's why I think from a Canadian government point of view, there's a moral upside, but a practical, political, and economic potential downside, which is impeding them. And the only way to deal with that is there has to be much, much more popular support so that the government feels that it pays a price for not being more supportive of human rights for Palestinians.
Would you care to comment on how the Western media has framed the events of the last 2 years?
Well, I think we have been largely driven by the Israeli narrative. We have whether it's the Globe and Mail or the Citizen, and I think the best mass media organization has been the CBC, notwithstanding there are lots of criticisms to make of it. But our media gets, for example, our reporting from the CBC is from Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. If you're a reporter in Jerusalem, where do you get your information from? Well, you go around to the Israeli military and ask for their perspective on things, and you ask other journalists who do the same thing. You might go to Egypt, but basically our feeds are from Israel, and we get an Israeli perspective. That doesn't mean that all the people we have in CBC, for example, coverage is sold, bought and paid for by the Israelis. No, but that's the soup that they're swimming in. So I think that is very much reflected in our general presentation, and I think that, of course, affects most Canadians because most Canadians don't go into this very deeply. They're not clear of what's going on, and so they read the headlines, and that's as far as things go.
Do you believe that the fact that Canada has been sending arms to Israel or exposes Canada to any legal liabilities?
I'm sorry. I think there's some people who argue that, but I'm not a lawyer and I don't know. I can't answer that. It certainly exposes it to a moral liability, but whether it is a legal liability, I'm not in a position to answer.
I recall that Senator Yu, is it, that has introduced a motion in the Senate to ask the government to consider that question.
To look into the impact of Canadian complicity. Good for you. I'd forgotten that, but that's true. But that's not means that it's purely to try to force the government to face on the fact that it's a possible reality. That's right.
One of our participants is pushing back a little bit on the scenario of what occurred on October 7th, and particularly the PTSD crazed teens.
Okay.
He feels it's not a very persuasive argument.
Well, what can I say? I probably can't convince you. What I can tell you, though, is that I have talked to psychologists and psychiatrists who've been in Gaza and who have told me that a very high percentage of Palestinian youth are emotionally disturbed. There's a lot of sickness. Particular doctor friend of mine, Bill Slaughter, who from Seattle, who was in Gaza doing seminars with Palestinian doctors. This was before October 7th, dealing with young people and their trauma. So you don't have to necessarily agree with me. I think if you search it a little bit on the internet, you'll probably find that there's some evidence. You'll probably find some Israeli sources to say it's not true at all.
Why don't the Palestinians overthrow Hamas?
Why don't they overthrow Hamas?
Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, I showed you those numbers, Grafton, that Hamas is the most popular political party amongst Palestinians today. So the question that most people, when they ask that question, they're coming from the assumption, widely held Canadian assumption, that the real problem is the extremists on both sides. Netanyahu's an extremist and the Hamas are extremists. If we just get rid of the extremists, everything would work out fine. The problem is that is a superficial and erroneous analysis. Most of the Palestinians realize that Israel's objective is to get rid of them. Most of them know that Hamas is an armed force. They see that as their armed force to protect them against Israelis. Has it been effective in protecting them? No. But don't forget, in the West Bank, where Hamas is not operative, the PA has not been effective either. So Israeli settlers and soldiers are killing Palestinians in the West Bank at a rapid rate. They're establishing new settlements. They're tearing down olive orchards and so on. So if you were to get rid of Hamas, would you want PA to come in? And they've actually proved themselves to be ineffective. I think it's a question that is rooted in not really understanding what the basic dynamics are here. The dynamics that every Palestinian. I remember talking to Palestinians 10 years ago when I was there, and Palestinians telling me what Israel wants to do is to drive us all out. And I remember assuring them that that could never happen. That maybe there was a Nakba in 1947 where the West didn't do anything, and in 1967 where the West did anything. But today, with the internet, with the power of international communications, there's no way the West would allow Israel to expel 2 million Palestinians. Well, guess what? They were right, and I was wrong.
What does OFIP believe needs to happen for there to be a real peace based on justice in Israel and Palestine? What actions do each of the parties, excuse me, do each of the parties need to take?
President, I cannot speak for OFIP. I am the chair of OFIP, that's true, but we haven't had a debate, and I'm sure that different members of our advisory council might have different views on this. So I don't want to implicate anybody in that. But I will say that I believe that the only long-term solution consists of the end of the Jewish supremacist ideology that motivates Israeli society, that this land is theirs and theirs alone. There needs to be some kind of truth and reconciliation movement in Israel to recognize that what they did was wrong. It's not consistent with human rights and natural law, and a new path needs to be worked out. But as long dividing it in two different countries, for example, as long as the Israelis still believe that all of it's theirs, they'll just be itching for an opportunity to go to war again. So the only way that this can be dealt with is a radical ideological rethinking inside Israel, and that's a difficult issue to tackle. Are you having trouble getting questions, or are there lots of questions? I'm happy to answer, but I see it's 8:45 now. I'm ready to go for another 10 minutes or so. What do we?
I think we're getting near the end of them. What do you think is the most effective way for Canadian citizens to convey to our politicians our support for Palestinians, or you can more broadly our opinions on this issue?
My feeling on that is at variance with what a number of the activist groups think. I think that it's good to write letters to politicians. It's good to write letter to your member of parliament, but somehow we've got to do more to get our other civil society organizations involved. The Doctors Association, the Nurses Association, the Teachers Association, the Students Associations. Right now, it is useful for the 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people to write to the government expressing their anger and indignation, which is very justified. But we've got to get tens of thousands of people mobilized through their own organizations. I saw, for example, the city of Burnaby has passed a resolution on opposing Israeli apartheid. If a dozen, 50, 100 Canadian municipalities were to pass something like that, if teachers associations would do something, if nurses associations, the doctors, lawyers associations, they've been very, very quiet so far. And that somehow that's how we're going to gradually build up pressure so the Canadian government feels a political need, Canadian political parties feel a political need to stand up more for Palestinian rights and to insist that Canada live up to the obligations that it's already signed up for at the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and so on and so forth.
Maybe just to further on that, could you speak a little bit to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement?
Well, I think it's a great idea. I think it should be encouraged. I think I can see for a long time it was seen as primarily an economic thing, but in this last summer, there's been the boycott thing has morphed into sanctions. So in Spain, the Spanish bicycle race had to pull out the Israeli participation. There was an issue in Halifax where people rightly objected to the fact that the Canada Davis Cup team was facing Israel and they had to play that match in secret. So the sanctions against Israel, remember again in the BDS or in the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa, of course there were boycott of oranges and wine, but the real thing that caused harm for South Africa was when they started to not be able to participate in football, soccer matches, rugby matches, and there was being expelled from the Commonwealth, suspended from the Commonwealth, and so on and so forth. So I think the BDS movement it's on the one hand, it's facing severe opposition, particularly in the US, but at the same time, the opposition to Israel is growing and it's going to be manifested in lots of different ways.
Okay, I think I'll wrap up with maybe one combined question here. What do you think of the one-state solution? And I assume that we're referring to a one democratic state solution. And what would Hamas propose what would happen to the Jews in such a scenario? In a liberated Palestine or in a one democratic state?
I think that's an excellent unanswered question. I know lots of Palestinians who tell me privately that they see a liberated Palestine like Canada, where people could be Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever. But that's their individual opinion. There are small groups that hold that opinion. But right now, the major groups, Hamas or the PA, don't have a clear, as far as I know, a clear opinion on that. And I think that is a challenge for the Palestinians to come up with a program that they can hold out to the world and say, this is what we want. And I think right now they are clear on what they don't want. They don't want to be expelled. They don't want to be facing a genocide and so on. Understandably, that's their priority. But I do think that for this to be resolved, they will have to come to a clear, if not unanimity, certainly some clarity on what they want. So in my view, that's still some work to be done.
I think perhaps we can wrap up now. There's a number of other questions in the Q&A, and perhaps if there's one that I haven't found that you would like to respond to, Peter, you could go ahead now. I just would like to thank one of our viewers who says this is a fantastic webinar and wonders whether OFIP has any sister chapters in other parts of the country. Well, not yet, but maybe someday.
Rather than, first of all, thank you for that compliment for the person who said that. And we wish something, we'd be glad to help if there's someone else wants to do it in another part of the country. I think rather than my trying to pick a question that I think is better than others, they're all good questions, I would encourage people to write me their questions, and I'd be glad to answer to the extent that I can. I also am very happy to invite people to write back, like that one man or woman who was unconvinced by my claim of the PTSD suffering Palestinians. Please feel free to write back your disagreements. this is not very useful if everything I've said you already agree with. Then we've had a good time, but we haven't really learned anything. So I would much rather hear from people saying I disagree with you for this, that, and the other. So please do that. I encourage you to make a small contribution. I would send out an email to all of you with a link to the webinar, and that I'll be making a small appeal for money as well for OFIP. We don't have big expenses, but they are continual expenses for the webinar, the Zoom, and so on and so forth. And please feel free to share it as well, because I think that this is a serious issue, and Canada deserves to have a serious conversation. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Grafton, and thank you to all the people who attended until the end. Thank you for all your questions, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you all.
Looking for a way to capture the questions. Somehow there's a way to capture. Maybe it's. Do you know how to do that, Grafton? Thank you, Stella.
You're still recording.
You're not shut off.
I know. Thank you. I'm thank you. Save. There we go. Save chat. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm off to have maybe have a small drink. Have a good evening. Bye bye.
Okay. Good evening.